Of all the Space Marine legions, none exemplifies the virtues of martial honor and strict self-control more than the World Eaters. Just as Angron transcended his violent youth, he ensured that his legion would shrug off every setback and betrayal to become paragons of the warrior's creed and ardent supporters of the Emperor's intention to unify the galaxy. These are the Loyal Sons of Angron. According to Caprinus' Speculum Historiale, the best record of Angron's early years, the young Primarch was born and raised into bloodshed and death. But never let these things claim him. Stolen away from the Emperor by the ruinous powers, and scattered throughout the galaxy, the infant Angron was found on an unnamed planet surrounded by the corpses of what were thought to be armed bandits that prowled the region. He was taken in by locals, was fed and clothed, and according to their traditions, promptly sold into slavery to repay their generosity. Given his obvious skill in the combat arts, he was forced first into small-time pit fighting, and inevitably was traded to the capital city's gladiatorial arena. The planetary rulers used the grand spectacle of the gladiatorial arenas to slake the population's bloodlust and to remind them of the penalty for thoughts of revolt. As the Primarch grew, so too did his reputation and his frustration. Ever eager to boast of the brutality of their fighters, the slavers had named him Angron, but the Emperor had made him to be more than a bloodthirsty taker of skulls. It was his name, but not what he was. Angron resented that he and his fellow gladiators were being forced to fight and kill for the pleasure of their masters and that of the baying crowds. Even worse were the physical and mental mutilations imposed upon them to provide better sport, implants, glanding, and the replacement of arms with hooks or blades were all commonplace in the arenas. Angron saw them all as an attempt to steal the only things the slaves still possessed: their dignity and sense of self. Worst of all were the psychosurgical procedures where aggression chips were implanted directly into the brain, turning the subject into little better than a mindless berserker. After suffering this fate, Angron bent all his will to escaping these puppet masters. The walls were high and the guns of the guards powerful, but using his natural talent as a warrior and leader of men, he found a way. During a mass display of gladiatorial combat, the slaves as one turned their weapons on their guards. Angron's meticulous and inspired planning saw to it that they took control of the arena with a minimum of casualties. But the bloodshed that followed shocked him to the core. With freedom in sight, many of Angron's gladiator brothers became uncontrollable, and with the guards routed, continued to fight rather than make good their escape. In the height of blind fury, some of the berserkers turned on the fleeing crowds, and even in their numbers, their brother gladiators. The slave army escaped the city, but without their berserker brethren, which remained to kill and be killed. The experience brought home with Angron that without iron-willed self-control, they would lose themselves. The look in the eyes of his blood-drunk former brothers he had been forced to kill that day convinced Angron that he himself must never suffer that fate. While the gladiators fled into the wild lands, the rulers of the city assembled and dispatched an army of mercenaries to chase them down. Angron and his brothers ambushed overconfident and ill-disciplined soldiery, stripped them of their weapons and provisions, and sent them back to the city as a bloody warning not to pursue them any further. However, with the word of Angron's escape spreading and fomenting unrest among the gladiators in other cities, this was not something the Planet's rulers were able to ignore. Fearing for their grip on power and no longer underestimating this simple gladiator, a force 100,000 strong was mobilized and sent to scour the land. Against such overwhelming force, Angron's only option was to press further and further into the mountains, but eventually there was nowhere left to go. At the summit of Fedon Moor, Angron and his brothers prepared to make their last stand. In the times since the loss of the Primarchs, the Emperor had not been idle. Guided by his unparalleled psychic talents, he homed in on his lost sons, and so it was that as Angron prepared to address his army for the hopeless battle to come, Imperial ships of the Great Crusade hastily entered orbit. Unwilling to risk losing his son before they had even been reunited, the Emperor ordered that Angron be teleported aboard, but Horus, who was accompanying his father, urgently counseled against it. Horus's peerless insight into the psychology of the world recognized that to whisk a true leader to safety while his army was butchered would be intolerable. He saw that such an act would irrevocably taint the relationship with bitterness and resentment from the start. Horus successfully convinced his father that there was a better way, and when the sun rose on the mountain, the slavers' armies were faced not only by Angron's former gladiators, but by the master of mankind and the Astartes of the Lunar Wolves. Against such powerful adversaries, the slavers' forces were easily routed. As they fled the field in disarray, Angron approached his father through the smoke and knelt in supplication, recognizing the bond between them and respecting the true nobility of the Emperor and his cause. Accepting the inevitable, the planet's ruling elites quietly stepped down from power, and the world rapidly acceded into the Imperium. Horus took Angron under his wing, educating him in every aspect of the Imperium. In doing so, he was able to assuage his brother's lingering doubts that he would simply be swapping one set of chains for another. But the Emperor was far from being just another slaver who wanted him to fight and die for his own amusement. Their first meeting on Fedon War had gone a long way towards this, and the presence of Horus and his Lunar Wolves overcame Angron's initial misgivings about implants and psychic conditioning that becoming a Marine entailed. At first, the process seemed to be eerily similar. The aggression chips and cybernetic implants that the slavers had forced upon the gladiators, and which had made them less than human. However, after seeing the Lunar Wolves in action, Angron knew that such things were merely tools to make them more efficient warriors, and with rigid self-control, they were nothing to be feared. When the 12th Legion finally arrived to formally meet their Primarch, Angron was ready for command. Angron had not forgotten his old comrades, and the army of former slaves were the first from the planet to join his new legion. The aggression chips were cast off as tools of the oppressor, and the legion was dedicated to the course of martial honor and iron will self-control. Berserker fury became a shadow of the past, a legacy of their enslavement that would never again be permitted. Committed to the glory of the Imperium and the Emperor, they would be masters of their own fates. Some aspects of his past, such as his own name, Angron, retained, and even embraced as reminders what they must always fight against. Back in the arena, the slavers called Angron and his fellow gladiators the World Eaters, to brag to other cities of how violent and frenzied they were. Thus, to the surprise of members new and old, he chose it to remind them of the darkness against which they must always guard. He renamed the 12th Legion the World Eaters. In the following years, the World Eaters became synonymous with martial honor and were paragons of the Emperor's dream to reunite humanity in the galaxy. Their grand companies often fought alongside those of the Lunaborns, with Angron's idealism tempering Horus's more pragmatic approach. In fact, at a banquet to celebrate the successful completion of the Herax compliance, Horus publicly praised Angron as his moral compass. When Horus was elevated to the rank of War Master at Ulanor, none was more forthcoming in support for his mentor than Angron, and it seemed that even with the Emperor returning to Terra, the Great Crusade would be in safe hands. Sadly, it was not to be. First, the War Master was laid low by an unknown malady, and then word came that Rabute Gilliman had declared the vast swaths of the galactic East liberated by his Ultramarine Legion to be an independent realm, the so-called Ultramar Segmentum. Such an affront to the Imperial dream saw the World Eaters pledge themselves immediately to bringing Gilliman back to his senses, or to end this betrayal once and for all. Under the command of Rogodorn, the Emperor's Praetorian, 7 legions assembled in orbit around the Ultramarines' latest conquest at the 5th planet of the Istvan system. The World Eaters, along with the Emperor's children and Raven Guard, made planetfall into what they were told was a shattered and broken rebel legion. But instead, they were devastated by the guns of both the Ultramarines and their erstwhile allies. Dorn had been corrupted by the Chaos Gods and had taken the Imperial Fists, Iron Hands, Dark Angels, and Salamanders with him into damnation, knowing the World Eater's legendary idealism and loyalty to the War Master. Dorn had not even attempted to turn them to his cause. Instead, he opted to use them as a blood sacrifice to his Dark Masters and to buy the Ultramarines' neutrality in the coming war, wading through rivers of their own blood. The shattered remnants of the 3 loyal legions fought their way to evacuation. Angron's martial code demanded that such a gross betrayal must not stand unchallenged, but even he knew there was nothing to be gained from suffering a glorious massacre. Their mission now became to warn the Emperor of Dorn's treachery. After dragging as many of their fallen brethren as they could onto the evacuation landers, they came under intense fire from heavy weaponry from salamanders commanded by Vulcan, their hideously disfigured Primarch. With shuttles and landers full of his brothers exploding around him, Angron took this final opportunity to save his legion and to fill his personal code. He threw open the hatch and leapt out of the slowly rising vessel into the midst of the salamanders. The heavy weapons directed against the transports were silenced, and the few survivors of the three legions evacuated to safety. Angron's ultimate fate is a matter of heated conjecture. The World Eaters and the Emperor's children both assert that he met his end in combat with the turncoat Vulcan, while scurrilous black propaganda spouted by the Salamanders hints at a considerably less heroic end. Needless to say, ever since the heresy, the World Eaters have taken every opportunity to fight for the Salamanders. Any campaigns involving these two legions, such as the Battle of Skullthrax or the Cleansing of Gorfran, are bitterly contested in the extreme. After Istvan, the World Eaters were reduced to a shadow of their former strength. They limped back to their homeworld with the intention to rebuild their forces and to play some part in ending Dor's treachery. But it was not to be. The heresy had reached even their own planet. The former rulers of the world were gone from power, but still retained much wealth and influence. On their isolated estates away from prying eyes, they continued their decadent ways and fell into the worship of chaos. History is unclear whether this happened independently or as part of Dorn's plot to destabilize the Legion. But when they realized that the World Eaters had been decimated and the Imperium racked by a civil war, they seized their opportunity. Private armies besieged the legitimate imperial government, and paid agitators sought to raise mobs in rebellion. The war was short, though, as even in their weakened state, the World Eaters were quickly able to rout the enemy and re-establish order. Enraged at having power snatched away a second time, the deposed leaders enacted their final solution. If they could not have the planet, then no one would. At their command, powerful explosives detonated along seismic fault lines, and inside the planet's geothermal power plants, the spewing lava crossed the land and choking the atmosphere with ash. This triggered further waves of volcanic activity that plunged the world into darkness and caused a global extinction event. The World Eaters, protected by power armor, were the only survivors of the cataclysm, but even their fortress Modus Run was seriously damaged. Evacuating to their orbiting fleet, the Legion stood vigil over their dying homeworld for 100 days. None left, vowing always to remember, but never to return. Addendum number 1. Skullthrax. Their shared experiences on Istvan brought the legions of the World Eaters and Emperor's children together and forged a strong bond of friendship between the two despite their philosophical differences. Just decades after the heresy, while both legions were still in the midst of rebuilding, they deployed together to defend the world of Skullthrax from the Salamanders. The traitors claimed that the incineration of Skullthrax would anoint it as their new demon world, but together the Loyalists managed to avert this, and in doing so, extracted a measure of vengeance for the Salamanders' betrayal. At Istvan, the phrase "Remember Skullthrax" became a rallying cry for a resurgent Imperium, one that echoed from the halls of the High Lords on mighty Terra to the darkest depths of the Eye of Terror. Addendum number 2. Karn the Deathless. Angron's noble sacrifice on Istvan allowed a precious few World Eaters to escape the carnage, and with them they dragged as many of their wounded and dead brothers as they could. Among the corpses was Captain Karn, equerry to the Primarch himself, covered in the blood of 100 grievous wounds. Karn woke in the makeshift morgue later saying that Angron had come to him in a vision and told him that it was not yet time for Karn to join him, and that he still had a mighty task ahead. This proved to be the case. Karn led the tattered shreds of the Legion back to their homeworld, and as Legion Master overcame insurmountable challenges to rebuild and revive the World Eaters, having passed into the Veil of Death and yet returning all the stronger. Karn the Deathless is an analogy for the Legion itself. Before the Heresy, the World Eaters recruited extensively from the former gladiator and pit-slave population of their homeworld. These proved to be hardy and talented sorts of marines, although to their regret they found that not all were suitable. A proportion, be it through ill treatment or by inclination, took such enjoyment and abandoned in the spilling of blood that to become a World Eater was simply out of the question. Angron had seen the damage that the blood drunk could do to both themselves and their erstwhile friends, and decreed that iron-hard self-control was vital to become one with his legionnaires. Part of this was the removal of their aggression chips, and the ugly scar tissue that resulted from the procedure became a palpable reminder of their rejected past. In solidarity, the Terran legionnaires that had never had the procedure took to tattooing the scalp above the left temple, and even 10 millennia later, this practice still endures. After the destruction of their homeworld, the Legion necessarily had to draw their recruits from other systems. The World Eater fleets range far across the Imperium, so the Legion is able to select the finest candidates wherever they may be found. Each Grand Company's battle barges have the knowledge and resources to recruit to train the next generation of World Eaters. The Legion is well respected and universally regarded as being fair and honorable, and most planetary governors are eager to become a recruiting world with all the added protection this entails. Given their Primarch's origins as a pit fighter and gladiator, and Angron's devotion to martial honor, it is unsurprising that the Legion places such a particular emphasis upon close combat. This is reflected by the high number of assault squads found in their orders of battle, but far from being bloodthirsty maniacs. Its roots come from their own code of martial honor, and ironically, a desire to avoid indiscriminate slaughter. For many legions routinely use orbital bombardment and saturation firepower against the rebellious world. The World Eaters take great pains to minimize civilian casualties, even when it means that they themselves suffer greater losses as a result. It is against an enemy's leaders and military forces that they take the fight and test their mettle. There is no honor to be gained in butchering the old, infirm, or infants, especially when done from orbit. In close combat, the World Eaters know and suitably value each human life they take. On many occasions, most notably the famous assault on the rebellious Pantrum Junta and the boarding of the battle barge Black Narcissus, entire grand companies of World Eaters have taken to the field armed solely with bolt pistol and chain axe. However, that is not to say that the World Eaters eschew range weaponry, particularly when facing Xenos and warp-tainted opponents. The Bolter is as wholly an instrument of the Emperor's will to them as it is to any other loyal legions, and since their earliest days, World Eater Devastator squads have been referred with genuine honor as the teeth of the World Eaters. The Legion is clinical in its assessment of the best method to eliminate the Imperium's foes, and on the battlefield assault, tactical and Devastator squads mesh seamlessly into an unstoppable white and azure engine of power armored death. Having no homeworld, the World Eater Legion is now fleet-based and has spread itself out among the stars. Each Grand Company, numbering upwards of 1,000 battle brothers and commanded by a captain and his lieutenants, strive to perform their assigned duties to the utmost. Normally, at least 2/3 of the World Eater Grand Companies are to be found engaged in the Crusades proclaimed by the High Lords of Terra, a proportion unmatched by any other legion. These Grand Companies are at the vanguard of the battle against the ruinous powers and Xenos threats, and reclaiming areas of the galaxy long lost to imperial rule. Such a role is a dangerous one, even for the Legiones Astartes, and the vehemence with which the World Eaters pursue this task is enviable. Once the Crusade has achieved its objective, they return to the Imperium proper to recruit, train, and replenish their strength. Though this could be considered as reserve status, there are still many battles to be fought inside the Imperium. Rebellions against the rightful Imperial rule are sadly all too common. Pirate fleets plague the space lanes, and even the Imperial Crusades are unable to prevent wide-scale invasions by heretics and warlike alien races. The diffuse nature of World Eater Legion means that in practice, each Grand Company retains a great degree of independence. The ultimate authority is the Council of Captains, headed by the Legion Master, which by necessity meets almost exclusively by astropathic means. It is essential in coordinating the actions of the World Eaters across the Imperium, as well as ruling on the commitment of forces to Imperial Crusaders, and on rare occasions sanctioning the creation of a new Grand Company. The World Eaters retain their Primarch's sense of martial honor, discipline, and iron-willed self-control. They are, if anything, even more organized and regimented than the secessionist Ultramarines and their successor chapters. Although the World Eaters restrict themselves to military matters rather than extending it into the civilian side of things, despite the betrayals and losses they suffered during the heresy, the World Eaters have never lost their idealistic belief in the concept of the Emperor's Imperium. To this end, they are endlessly willing to contribute forces to crusade alongside other legions and the Imperial army. Unlike some of the other legions though, the World Eaters are motivated by a deep-seated belief that it is the right thing to do, rather than as a part of some political machination to serve their own agendas. While the Legion does maintain a librarium of psychically gifted battle brothers, they are few in number, and their remits specialized. This springs primarily from their innate distrust of the immaterial, instead preferring to rely on the heft of an honest chain axe for the summoning of eldritch fire. After the heresy revealed the horrifying scope of the threat posed by the ruinous powers, successive Legion Masters began to realize the value of being able to fight on the etheric plane as well. To this end, World Eater Librarians are charged with the vital role of sensing the malefic and warding the souls of their brethren from harm. These roles do not exempt librarians from their normal duties. They are World Eaters, and so are expected to prove themselves at the bloody edge of battle, a place in which their psychically attuned force weaponry comes in extremely useful. Gene seed of the Angron line suffers an unusual degree of genetic drift, and the Homophagia implant is absent altogether. Adeptus Mechanicus records show that the implant abruptly and inexplicably disappeared from samples submitted for purity testing in mid-M34. When the offer was made to return gene seed from 5 stocks which still contained the Homophagia, the Legion declined the offer, stating in no certain terms that such an implant was no longer required. The general degradation in gene seed quality is attributed to the use of higher than recommended doses of certain chemicals involved in marine hypnotherapy and indoctrination. This hazardous treatment allows World Eaters Marines to control their responses, emotions, and autonomic reactions beyond that of other legions, in line with their compulsion to enforce iron will self-restraint on the battlefield. While this genetic drift has not yet been observed to have materially affected the implant quality, there is serious concern that eventually the long-term viability of the gene seed as a whole could be in jeopardy. The Imperium can ill afford to lose the World Eaters, but despite this, the Legion has strenuously resisted pressure to modify its procedures. As for their battle cry, "For Angron and the Emperor!" is a common battle cry, although where World Eaters face traitors of the Salamander Legion, "Remember Skullfrax!" is often used. So, these are the Loyal Sons of Angron. They still retain some of their core innate qualities, do they not? Well, I guess they are the blood angels of the Dornian Heresy, am I right?